Violence escalates as Israeli forces strike Gaza from the sky. Airstrikes kill dozens of Palestinians, including children. But is the Muslim world doing enough to condemn Israeli atrocities? I'm Ali Mustafa, and today's Newsmakers is Israeli attacks on the Palestinians. They've been forced from the homes they've lived in for generations, fired upon as they worshipped, and then bombed from the sky. Palestinians are under attack, and many of them feel they've been abandoned by the world. The latest escalation began as Israel ordered the expulsion of Palestinian families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem to make way for Jewish settlers. And one particularly striking confrontation was caught on camera.
Jacob, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
it's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
Yeah, you are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, يا عمي.
זה לא שלי להחזיר.
בוא נגיד שיש
In the days since, the tension has spiraled out of control. Thousands made their way to Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in the Old City in solidarity with those in Sheikh Jarrah. As they prayed at Islam's third holiest site, Israeli police attacked them, injuring hundreds, including children. In retaliation, Hamas militants in Gaza fired rockets into Israel, which responded by killing dozens of Palestinians in a series of airstrikes, which the US State Department struggled to condemn.
You know, the Israelis killed 13 people just now, you know, including maybe 5 or 6 children. Do you condemn that? Do you condemn the killing of children?
Saeed,
I'm asking you, do you condemn the killing of Palestinian children?
Obviously, and these reports are just emerging, and I understand, I was just speaking to the team, I understand we don't have independent confirmation of facts on the ground yet, so I'm very hesitant to get into reports that are just emerging. Obviously, the deaths of civilians, be they Israeli or Palestinians, are something we would take very seriously.
Okay.
Now, while the US has struggled to outright condemn Israel's actions, they might not be the only ones. Several nations in the Muslim world have issued statements denouncing the events, but has their criticism gone far enough? And are their words having any impact on Israeli behavior? To discuss that, let's cross over to Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, where I'm joined by Nour Odeh, a former spokesperson for the Palestinian Authority. Also in Ramallah, joining us is Mustafa Barghouti. He's the Secretary General of the Palestinian National Initiative and a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council. And Dave Harden is in Washington, D.C. He led the USAID assistance mission in Gaza and the West Bank for more than a decade. Let's begin with you, Dave, because we're just getting off that Ned Price thought, and you're also running for a seat in Congress from Maryland's 1st District. Why is this White House under Joe Biden, that prides itself on human rights the world over, refusing to condemn Israeli airstrikes which have killed civilians, including children?
Well, to be honest with you, I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a distraction to Joe Biden's agenda and the demands and the needs that we have in America right now. And the brutal reality is we're just coming out of a pandemic. We have a massive economic crisis that we're kind of climbing through. And what Biden doesn't need is escalation and another war between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So all of this is both unfortunate and, of course, it's deeply sad for the people, the innocents, the civilians on the ground. We've gone through this many times. And what we need now is a path forward that is entirely different from the violence that we're seeing today.
Nour, Dave calls it a distraction for the Biden administration. As a former spokesperson of the Palestinian Authority, have the Palestinians been abandoned in your view?
Well, the U.S. was never in the Palestinians' pocket. Anybody who thought that the Biden administration would be the Messiah was sorely mistaken, maybe even delusional. Having said that, I think the international community could do a lot more, even without U.S. involvement, even with the Biden administration's a busy agenda. There are international obligations that countries must honor. States that pride themselves on being champions of international law and human rights should not be hypocritical when it comes to treating Israel with all that exceptionalism and should subject Israel to the accountability it must face. Otherwise, we're going to stay in this hellhole of a cycle where Palestinians continue to be on the receiving end of the brutality of a colonial regime that will fight to the last drop of Palestinian blood to maintain its control over the entirety of historical Palestine.
Yeah, but I'm going to move the questions to Mustafa now. But the Americans say that the Israelis have a right to defend themselves from Hamas rockets, and that's what Ned Price also emphasized on. You mentioned that Biden is not a messiah, Nour. Mustafa, the Biden administration has given a signal that it will approve a $25 billion purchase of F-35 fighter jets by the UAE as part of the Abraham Accords. How significant are the Abraham Accords 8-9 months after they were signed between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain from where you are sitting in Ramallah?
These accords are not about peace. They are about creating an alliance between Israel and some Arab countries against the Palestinian interest and against the interest in the region. And they are about practically stabbing the Palestinians in the back. And that's why we do not see today any serious positions regarding the barbaric bombardment of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Almost 30 people have been killed, and including 10 children. One of these children is disabled. Israeli violations have gone beyond any red line. I mean, I was in Jerusalem myself, and I witnessed the attacks on prayers in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. There was no justification for what Israel did. More than 600 people were injured in 2 days in Jerusalem. 4 of them are in critical conditions. 6 people have lost their eyes. This is a barbaric behavior of a regime, the Israeli regime, that is practicing not only occupation for 54 years against Palestinians, but that has established what the world community considers war crimes, including the system of apartheid and racial discrimination, and the system of oppression and persecutions against Palestinians.
Mustafa,
that's not what I...
Sorry to interject. The United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and many other Muslim and Arab countries have condemned this latest round of violence. So it's not like condemnations aren't coming in. But on the other hand, these are countries that have also made peace with Israel. So how does that work?
Condemnations mean nothing, and statements mean nothing. What we need is boycott, divestment, and sanctions on this Israeli apartheid regime.
Yeah, but that's a touchy subject, especially in the United States. Let's push this BDS argument to Dave in D.C. There's legislation at the state level. Some efforts were being made in Congress as well to outlaw boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or any boycott of the state of Israel, to make it a punitive measure, in fact. How do you view it? Do you agree with Mustafa that this is the way to go?
The United States is not the key party here. This, unfortunately, for the last 50 years, we've tried to be the key party. We've tried to kind of broker peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I think it's accurate to say, Biden isn't the Messiah, and he shouldn't be. This is a conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. By the way, things are different now. The Abraham Accords have changed fundamentally the relationships in the Middle East, and both the Israelis and the Palestinians are going to have to adapt to that. Now, it's crystal clear that the Israelis are the stronger party and need to be more accommodating and kind of figure out what their future is going to be, because nobody's leaving. The Palestinians aren't leaving. The Israelis aren't leaving. The grievances are continuing to fight to create this conflict. But to find and to think that the answer rests solely in the United States, and even something for like BDS, is missing the fundamental point of the grievances between the parties.
Yeah, but that's a false equivalence, Dave. You can't say that this is between the Palestinians and the Israelis. You've got a supra-state armed to the teeth in the form of Israel, and you've got the Palestinians who don't even have citizenship, basic rights. Nobody's asking for the United States to step in as a messiah. But to say that the US hasn't played a role in the past few months to embolden Israeli behavior would be incorrect as well, wouldn't it?
No, I don't think. Look, the Israelis are the stronger party, and they need to make the first step for accommodations. And there are many steps that the Israelis can take to deconflict the situation right now and to put the parties on a path towards peace. Okay, so let me be really clear about that. But I think it's inaccurate to say that the United States has emboldened Israel going forward. Not at all. I think that that's completely not the case. If anything, Biden's election, which ousted Trump, has probably created a little bit more fragility in the and certainly between Netanyahu and Biden. So I don't buy that premise in the least.
Nour, how would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, U.S. policy has not just emboldened; it has bankrolled these Israeli policies. It has enabled Israel and encouraged it, and even provided it with political goods, with rewards for veering more to the right, for becoming more extreme. Almost all the parties that ran in this fourth Israeli election ran on a no agenda. No to the Palestinian state, no to Palestinian refugee rights, no to two-state solution, no to negotiations with the Palestinians, no to ceding back East Jerusalem, which is occupied under international law. All of this came out of what? The fact that the U.S. now has an embassy illegally situated in Jerusalem, that the Trump administration recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and that the Biden administration hasn't moved an inch from that illegal policy, that it is encouraging countries like the UAE to continue down the path of legitimizing illegal settlements, of normalizing their existence, of normalizing trade relations with them, and to move forward on the path of legislating the criminalization of protesting peacefully as Americans against Israeli policies. All of that, of course, emboldens Israel. It emboldens the right wing in Israel, and it makes it all the more difficult for any credible pathway forward to be found. Sanctions are the way, because that's what states do to states when grave violations of international law.
But Nour, you have to give some credit.
Applied everywhere. Israel should never be the exception.
That's an impossibility when you have. That's an impossibility when you have statements from DC coming that this is a conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The US can play no role in that, let alone sanction any party. We'll continue this, but I want to go quickly to Mustafa. Mustafa, in August...
$38 billion then in over 10 years. If it does that, I'm willing to play with that argument.
All right, there is some talk in the US Congress on putting conditions on aid, military aid and other aid to Israel, but that's a conversation that isn't going anywhere. Mustafa, in August of last year, days after the Abraham Accords were signed, the Saudi former ambassador to Washington, D.C., Al-Bandar, came out on Al Arabiya and made some stark accusations against the Palestinian Authority for failing the Palestinian people. What responsibility, if any, in your mind, does the Palestinian leadership bear for this current impasse, for this current situation?
The main mistake by the Palestinian Authority is that it believed in Oslo. and it believed an illusion that the Zionist movement and Israel wants to have a compromise. The reality has shown that Israel does not want a compromise. All they want is to annex the whole of Palestine. And that's why the main mistake that
But what do the Palestinian leadership want? What is it capable of? Is it even relevant?
It's capable of changing the strategy and concentrate on resisting occupation and apartheid.
But
Mansour
Abbas has been in power for...
Please don't interrupt. Can you allow me to continue my sentence, please?
Go on, please.
Yeah, it should unite the Palestinians and help steadfast, and also understand that we will not be able to get anything unless we change the balance of power on the ground, as people in Jerusalem have been doing. But let me also comment on the fact that United States is not a key party. On the contrary, United States is a key party because it is the main supporter of Israel. Israel is a rich country, but it is the largest recipient of USAID money worldwide. United States is providing military support to Israel. United States is covering up Israeli crimes in the Security Council and in the United Nations. So United States is responsible also for the crimes that are committed here, especially the annexation of East Jerusalem and the annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights. Annexing occupied territory is nothing but a crime in international law. And the fact that the United States is not doing anything against it makes it actually a participant in the crime.
Dave, I'll go directly to you. How do you respond?
Biden's been in power for 120 days. The United States doesn't have the key to the solution here, despite what everybody is saying. It's kind of a false equivalency right here when the parties, and I want to reemphasize that the Israelis are the stronger party and they need to be the ones that make the bigger and most immediate and first concessions,
but
right?
They're not.
But at the end of the day, the United States simply does not have the key to the answer. We've tried for 50 years. I was on the negotiating team. We failed for decades. You know, the situation is different today with the Abraham Accords and kind of some changing trends in the Middle East. These are the realities. The Palestinians have to understand and recognize that. And the Israelis, of course, have to be the ones that make the first and most important steps towards deconflicting these risks.
I know
whether they do or not, I don't know. But the point is, it's, 50 years and no result.
I know Mustafa shaking his head, but before I go to him to respond to what you just said, it's not like there hasn't been condemnation or support in the Muslim world. In fact, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan came out with this statement that he will arrange for some sort of consensus in the Muslim world. There have been moves to call for an extraordinary meeting of the OIC as well. What does this amount to? Does this amount to anything? Let's go to Nour and then I'll bring in Mustafa. Go ahead, Nour.
Well, I mean, these are important political positions, perhaps, but the reality is, and like Dr. Mustafa was saying, statements do nothing. While Muslims and Arabs are providing us and showering us with all these statements of solidarity, Israel is receiving political cover, it's receiving financial assistance and military assistance. And at the end, it's Palestinians who are on the receiving end of all of this violence and brutality. If all of these sentiments, which we assume are genuine, are to have an effect, then we need to see countries taking real measures, stopping any trade relations that benefit the Israeli colonial regime, stopping all relations that normalize Israeli settlements, which are a war crime, employing the pressure that they can, employing the cards that they have at play, not just with Israel, but also with other countries, to make sure that Palestine is front and center, and that this issue is not, reduced to a very superficial statement of, oh, let the Palestinians and Israelis figure it out, it is their conflict. No, it's not. It's actually an international conflict. It was born in the United Nations, and that this injustice has continued for over 70 years. The fact is, this conflict will not end unless Israel understands that there will be serious very serious political, economic, military consequences for its continued occupation. All the solidarity in the world won't do that, but real action, the buying power of the Muslim world and the Arab world can, the political will of the Muslim world and maybe some of the Arab world can as well. That's where the difference is, and I think that's where we need to focus our energies at the popular level and also at the official level.
Not when a lot of the Muslim countries or major Muslim countries are either doing business with Israel after the Abraham Accords. We're talking about billions of dollars of investment going into the UAE, going into Israel from the UAE. So, but going back to Dave's point, this conflict has been going on, especially if you talk about the 1967 war and the occupation of Jerusalem. It's been over 50 years. It's all talk. So Mustafa, doesn't Dave have a point then that this has to be resolved at the end of the day between the Palestinians and the Israelis because there's no escape for either one of them?
It's not a conflict. It's one side oppressing the other. It's one side occupying the other. It's one side creating a system of apartheid against the other. It's Israel that is practicing occupation, apartheid, and discrimination against Palestinians, and nobody can equate between us. This misleading statement that it is a conflict tries to put the situation as if it's two equal parties fighting over a piece of land. It's not true. It's one side who is oppressing the other. And I think that your guest has been using, as the United States has been doing, a double standard here. Why the United States imposed sanctions on Russia? Because Russia took over Crimea. Although, by the way, Crimea was part of Russian land at one point of time. Why this is not applied to Israel, which is occupying our land?
Well, let's ask Dave.
Why this is not
Let's
happening?
ask.
Because
Let's put your
there is a lot
question.
of hypocrisy here, and it's mainly because there is a strategic alliance between the United States administrations and Israel, and in that sense, they are supporting violations of international law.
Dave?
Obviously, it's a conflict.
It's not a conflict.
There can be no doubt that of course, there's a conflict.
No, it's not.
Conflicts happen when people die, when
fight.
rockets fly. It's obviously a conflict.
Would you define
Right,
what's
and at
happening,
the end-
Dave? Would you define what's been
But
happening
do
between the
you
Israelis and the
admit that
Palestinians?
there is occupation or not?
Hold on,
Do you admit
Mustafa.
that
Hold on,
Israel is
Mustafa.
occupying us?
Hold on, Mustafa. Let me ask Dave a question. How would you define?
sorry.
Would you define the fights or the between Israelis and the protesters? Are they clashes or is it an assault by the Israelis?
So I think we're on the tipping edge of an all-out war. And that would be catastrophic, as it has been in all the other wars, recently. We're not exactly at a war right this minute, but we risk having this spill out of control into
A war between who?
widespread
A war between who?
I mean, there's overlapping elements to this, but essentially Israelis and Palestinians. I mean,
But the
Gaza is the
Palestinians are
point of the
occupied.
sphere.
They don't have a state, so they can't be in a war.
All right, well, if you believe that, that's fine. But for the people who die on the ground, they consider it a war and a conflict.
All right, let's
certainly.
open it up. I want a quick response from Nour, and then Mustafa. Nour, go ahead to what Dave just said.
It's not a state because when the question is about self-defense, according to the spokesperson of the State Department, but it is a state when the issue is war, so that a false sense of equivalence is created between Israel and Palestine. Palestine is a state by natural right, not because the U.S. recognizes it or not, but it is under occupation, under Israeli colonial occupation, and that's what the problem is. When we talk about conflict, we're talking about two equal sides, and there is no parity here. And the fact that the U.S. has maintained this false equivalence for political expediency is part and parcel of the problem, and it continues. Perhaps if the Biden administration is so busy with its own issues, it can take a seat back, but all the way back. It should stop providing Israel with cover at the UN Security Council and other UN organs.
Right.
It should stop providing unconditional military support, and it should take take off its intervention in the region. Maybe then there would be a chance for peace.
All right,
without
Noor. I
that
want to give
and the-
Mustafa Barghouti, who's been waiting patiently, the final word. Go ahead, Mustafa.
When Martin Luther King led the struggle against racism in the United States, nobody called it a conflict between white people and African Americans. It was a struggle between African Americans and a racist system that was discriminating against them. The same happened in South Africa. Nobody called the struggle of the South African people a conflict between the white people in South Africa and the black people. It was a struggle against injustice, and many white people were participating in it. So this is the same situation. It's justice and injustice, occupation against people who are occupied, oppression and apartheid. The United States and all other countries of the world, if they want to be fair, they should stand up to Israel and tell it you cannot be impunitive to international law. You have to be accountable. And that means imposing sanctions on Israel till it stops its occupation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barghouti. Unfortunately, that's the time we have. Nour Odeh, Mustafa Barghouti from Ramallah, and Dave Harden from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much. And thank you for watching. See you next time.